Just after 3 in the morning, November 29th, 1944. The Pacific, off the coast of Japan, a young sailor stood at his post on the largest warship the world had ever seen, and he was not afraid. How could he be? Beneath his feet was more steel than any ship in history, armor thick enough to shrug off battleship shells, a hull so vast it seemed less like a vessel than a piece of moving country. He had been told she could not be sunk. He had believed it, because standing on her deck in the dark, the idea that anything could kill this ship was almost funny. Then the sea lit up. A column of water rose along the starboard side, taller than the flight deck, and the whole enormous ship shuddered like a struck bell. Then a second tower of water, a third, a fourth. 4 hammer blows walking down the hull in a matter of seconds, and under the sailor's feet the unsinkable ship gave a slow, sick lurch and began very slightly to lean. He did not know yet that he was already standing on a dead ship. He did not know that she would be gone before lunch. He only knew that somewhere out there in the darkness, something small and patient had found the greatest warship ever built on the first night of her life, and had put 4 torpedoes into her before anyone even knew it was there. Before I get into it, a little backstory. My dad fought in the Second World War, and growing up he told me stories about it all the time. And the more I listened, the more one thing fascinated me. Not what our side did, but what it looked like from the other side. The men who were supposed to win, what they saw, what they were told, and the moment they realized none of it was true. So that's how I like to tell these stories. Through the eyes of the enemy who couldn't stop us. And now here I am, passing on the stories I learned to you. To understand how a single submarine sank the largest warship on Earth, you have to understand the desperation that built her. Her name was Shinano. She began her life as something else entirely. She was laid down as the third of the great Yamato-class battleships, sisters to the 2 largest, most heavily armored battleships ever constructed, monsters that carried the biggest naval guns ever mounted on a ship. She was to be another of those steel gods, the pride of an empire that still believed the war would be decided by great fleets trading broadsides across the horizon. Then came the summer of 1942, and the Battle of Midway, and in a single catastrophic day, Japan lost 4 of her finest aircraft carriers. The war changed shape in an afternoon. It was no longer a war of battleships. It was a war of aircraft carriers, of planes flung out across hundreds of miles of ocean, and Japan had just lost the heart of her carrier fleet and could not replace it fast enough. So the planners looked at the half-built battleship sitting in her dock and made a decision. They would not finish her as a battleship. They would rebuild her as an aircraft carrier. The biggest the world had ever seen, a floating fortress of a flight deck armored like the battleship she had almost become, so heavily protected that no bomb, no torpedo, nothing the Americans had would ever be able to put her down. She would be unsinkable. That was not marketing. That was the actual design goal. An armored carrier that could sail into the worst the enemy could offer and simply refuse to die. They built her in total secrecy. The dock was screened off behind enormous walls and curtains so that no one, not foreign spies, not even most of Japan, could see what was taking shape inside. Workers were forbidden to speak of her. She grew in the dark, in silence, a secret the size of a city block, and the men who knew of her spoke of her the way you speak of a weapon that will turn the war around. But secrecy could not hide the one thing that was killing Japan by 1944, time, and the lack of it. By the autumn of that year, the war was closing in on the home islands. American submarines were strangling Japan's shipping. American bombers were beginning to reach the cities. Everyone knew that the great naval base where Shinano lay would soon be a target, and there was a terror that she might be caught and destroyed in her own dock before she ever put to sea. So the order came down that would doom her, finish her early, get her out, move her to another port to complete the work before the bombs found her where she sat. And so the greatest warship in the world was sent to sea unfinished. This is the part that matters, the part the young sailor on her deck did not understand. A warship is not just armor and guns. What keeps a ship alive when it is hit is not the thickness of its hull. It is the hundreds of sealed compartments inside, the watertight doors and hatches that trap flooding in one part of the ship so the rest stays afloat. It is the pumps, The drills, the trained damage control teams who know exactly what to do when the sea comes pouring in. A finished warship is a machine for surviving damage, and Shinano was not finished. Many of her watertight doors were not yet properly installed. Some could not be sealed at all. The compartments that were supposed to save her had not been tested against water, and some had not even been made airtight. Her pumps and firefighting systems were incomplete, and her crew, the men who were supposed to fight to save her, had been aboard only a matter of days. They had never trained together. They did not know the ship. Some of the men aboard that night were not even sailors, but dockyard workers, still finishing the construction, riding along because the work was not done. The unsinkable ship had been sent out to sea as a hollow, half-built giant, carrying a crew that barely knew her, exactly at the moment she most needed to be whole. Her captain, an experienced and capable officer named Toshio Abe, knew the risks. He knew his ship was not ready. But orders were orders, and the Empire was afraid, and so on the evening of November 28th, 1944, the largest warship ever built, slipped out of Tokyo Bay into the dark Pacific, riding on her pride and her armor and the belief that nothing could touch her. Out in that same darkness waited one small American submarine. Her name was Archerfish, and next to Shinano, she was nothing. A single submarine, one of hundreds the Americans had thrown into the Pacific. With a crew of fewer than 90 men, she was on patrol off the coast, and her commander, Joseph Enright, had known the frustration of the hunter who never quite gets his prize. But that night his radar picked up something to the north, something big. So big that at first they could hardly believe the size of it. A contact the size of a mountain, moving across the sea in the dark. What followed was not a battle. It was a hunt, and it lasted for hours. Here was the strange truth of that night. Shinano was faster than the submarine. On a straight run, she could have simply pulled away and left the American behind, and there would have been no story to tell. But two things saved the submarine and doomed the giant. The first was fear. Captain Abe, seeing a contact shadowing him, assumed he was being tracked by a whole pack of submarines, the way the Americans often hunted. And so instead of running flat out for safety, he zigzagged, he turned back and forth across his own path, a standard tactic to throw off a submarine's aim, and every zigzag bled away his speed and his lead. He was trying to be careful, and his caution kept bringing him back within reach of the one boat that was actually there. The second was a flaw in the unfinished giant herself. Something in her machinery, a bearing, a shaft was not right, and it forced her to hold down her speed. The fastest thing about her, the one quality that could have carried her clear, had been quietly crippled by the same haste that sent her to sea. So for hours, the little submarine ran along on the surface in the dark, pushing her engines to the limit, pacing the great ship, waiting. And then Shinano, in the middle of one of her careful zigzags, turned. She turned across the darkness and put herself, her vast armored flank, directly into the path of the waiting submarine. Enright could hardly believe his luck. The largest warship in the world had just handed him the perfect shot. Just after 3 in the morning, Archerfish fired 6 torpedoes at the giant and slipped away into the deep. 4 of them struck home. And here is where the pride of the Empire met the price of its haste. 4 torpedoes should not have been enough to kill a ship designed to be unsinkable. Her armor was not even the point of failure. The torpedoes struck low below the belt and tore open her hull to the sea. And then the sea did what no one had allowed the ship to prepare for. It spread. It poured through bulkheads that had never been sealed, through watertight doors that had never been fitted, through compartments that were supposed to hold it back, and instead simply passed it along, deeper and deeper into the ship. The very thing that was meant to save her, her honeycomb of sealed compartments, did not exist yet. She flooded like an open basket, and the men who should have saved her did not know how. They had been aboard for days. They did not know the layout of their own ship in the dark, with the power failing and the decks tilting under them. The pumps could not keep up or could not be made to work. The counter-flooding, the desperate art of deliberately flooding the other side of the ship to keep her level, was mishandled, and instead of steadying her, it helped drag her down. Captain Abe, believing to the last in the toughness of his ship, kept her steaming ahead for hours, trying to reach shallow water and beach her before she sank. But driving a flooding ship forward only forced more water in through the torn hull, and every mile he made cost him more of his ship. The great unsinkable carrier leaned further and further. The young sailor on her deck and thousands like him felt the angle grow under their feet through the small hours of the morning, felt the ship they had been told could not die begin, slowly and unmistakably, to die. There were too few lifeboats. The crew did not know the drills. Water climbed through the vast hollow spaces of a ship that had never been finished. At just before 11 in the morning, roughly 7 hours after 4 torpedoes found her in the dark, Shinano rolled over and went down by the stern into the deep Pacific. Captain Abe chose to go down with her. More than 1,400 men went with him into the sea. The escorting destroyers pulled a little over 1,000 survivors from the water, but the largest warship the world had ever built was gone. She had been a commissioned warship for 10 days. She had been at sea on the only voyage of her life for about 17 hours. And she was killed not by a fleet, not by waves of aircraft, but by a single submarine and fewer than 90 men who had simply been patient in the dark. To this day, no submarine in history has ever sunk a larger ship. The record set that night off the coast of Japan has never been broken, and almost certainly never will be. When you sit with what happened to Shinano, the tragedy is not really that she was unlucky. It is that she was a perfect portrait of the empire that built her. Japan had poured its steel and its pride and its secrecy into a single enormous monument to power. A ship designed to be invincible, a symbol that the war could still be won by sheer scale and spirit and armor. And then the reality of the war it was actually losing, the shortage of time, of trained men, of finished work, hollowed that monument out from the inside before it ever fired a shot. She was a god of steel with nothing behind her armor. Magnificent, unfinished, and doomed. And the thing that killed her was the opposite of everything she stood for. Not a monument, not a symbol, just one ordinary American submarine, one of many, part of a patient, relentless, unglamorous machine that was quietly closing its grip around the home islands. The Americans did not need to build a bigger giant to answer Shinano. They only needed one small boat to be in the right patch of dark ocean, with radar and fuel, and a captain willing to chase a mountain all night for the chance of a single shot. That was the lesson underneath the pride, and Japan learned it over and over in those final years. You can build the largest warship in the world, you can armor it against every weapon the enemy has, you can wrap it in secrecy and christen it the unsinkable pride of the empire. And it will not be enough if you cannot finish it, cannot crew it, cannot keep it alive when the sea comes in. The greatest ship ever built met the ordinary American war machine on her very first night, and the machine sent her to the bottom before the sun came up. The young sailor had been told nothing could sink her. He learned the truth in 7 hours of darkness and rising water. The empire had built him a god to stand on. It just never had the time to make it real.